Hello and welcome and happy new year to everybody. My name is Shannon Kemp and I'm the Chief Digital Officer of our Dataversity. We would like to thank you for joining today's Dataversity webinar, Apply Data Strategy. It is the latest installment in a monthly series called Data Ed Online with Dr. Peter Aiken. Hello and welcome and happy new year, everyone. My name is Shannon Kemp and I'm the Chief Digital Officer at Dataversity. We'd like to thank you for joining today's Dataversity webinar, Apply Data Strategy. It is the latest installment in the monthly series called Data Ed Online with Dr. Peter Aiken. Just a couple of points to get us started. Due to the large number of people that attend these sessions, you will be muted during the webinar. For questions, we will be collecting them by the Q&A section. And if you'd like to chat with us and with each other, we certainly encourage you to do so. Just to note, the Zoom defaults the chat to send to just the panelists, but you may absolutely change that to network with everyone. To open the Q&A or the chat panel, you can find those icons in the bottom middle of your screen for those features. And to answer the most commonly asked questions, as always, we will send a follow-up email to all registrants within 2 business days containing links to the slides. And yes, we are recording and will likewise send a link to the recording of the session as well as any additional information requested throughout the webinar. Now, let me introduce to you our speaker for today, Dr. Peter Aiken. Peter is an acknowledged data management authority, an associate professor at Virginia Commonwealth University, president of DAME International, and associate director of the MIT International Society of Chief Data Officers. For more than 35 years, Peter has learned from working with hundreds of data management practices in 30 countries, including some of the world's most important. Among his 13 books are many firsts. Starting before Google, before data was big, and before data science, Peter has founded several organizations that have helped more than 200 organizations leverage data-specific savings that have measured at more than 1.5 billion US dollars. His latest is Anything Awesome. And with that, let me turn everything over to Peter to get today's webinar started. Peter, hello and welcome.
Welcome, Shannon, and Happy New Year to you and everybody else who's listening. Of course, you're tuned in today to talk a little bit about data strategy. So a wonderful title, Applied Data Strategy. By the way, that burn thing is a really great way to start your programs off if you got the ability to do something like that. It just grabs people's attention. I've had people get scared because of it. But anyway, I want to start out with a Malcolm Gladwell quote. If you aren't a fan of Malcolm Gladwell, he's written a lot of things that people quote over and over again. And one of his, my favorite quotes of his is, "Practice isn't the thing you do once you're good. It's the thing that you do that makes you good." And in our context of our topic here today, absolutely, that's the kind of thing I want you to keep in mind. Strategy is inherently a repetitive process that can easily be improved. I'm reading a book on Chinese strategy right now, and they're improving it in 20-year increments, which is a very long-term perspective to take on things. Similarly, dependency. Data strategy exists to support organizational strategy. No other reason for it than that. And if it's focused on anything other than that, it's going to be a problem for you and the organization both. That strategy should be focused on evolution of your data capabilities, that things that you do in data that perhaps aren't perfect today, you're working on making them better, and you have a lot of choices as to that. So the question from strategy is, which ones should I do first, second, third, et cetera, et cetera. The plans that are produced as a result of most data strategy sessions are of limited values, and they always discount the obstacles that you run into, which is the focus of my next book that I'm writing with John Ladley called Managing Data Debt. There's an overemphasis on technology. People and process challenges are easily 90% of the problem. I know it says 95% there. I'll give you some numbers on that in a little bit. And the real question, of course, how does one get to Carnegie Hall? If you're familiar with that joke as a musician, the answer is practice, practice, practice. So our topics today are going to be a data strategy specifies how data assets are to be used to support the organizational strategy. Then we're going to look at a section where we're looking at how the relationship exists between data strategy and effective data governance, because a data strategy is necessary for effective data governance. Data governance without a data strategy tends to be aimless and drifting and not effective. Then we're going to look at some specific prerequisites that most organizations run into when they try to do a data strategy. They don't realize that there are, in what case I call them, 7 deadly data sins but stand between them and data strategy nirvana. And finally, the last part of this is the easiest part, what you do in order to actually do the implementation of your data strategy. Then, of course, about an hour from now, we'll come back with some Q&A, and I'll look forward to you guys talking to you about what your questions are around the program. It really is valuable because it helps me refine the program for the next version of it and make it better. So I appreciate all of your input on this. Again, jumping straight out, a data strategy specifies how data assets are to be used to support the organizational strategy. We're going to look at what is a strategy and what's a data strategy and how do they work together. Starting out, in most cases, people think strategy is complicated, and it doesn't have to be complicated, but it often is presented as complicated. You'll see why in just a bit. But I wanted to show you an artifact that I found out there on the interweb. This is supposedly an official strategic diagram of how Disney does their strategy. And you know what? This was done in 1957, first 2 years before I was born, but it is equally valid today. That's a real testament to the longevity of the Disney organization and how much they have been able to do this. And again, if you look around here, it says, well, we've got a lot of things, but they're all related. And we're going to try to have things that are plugging other things, self-reinforcement all the way around. It's a beautiful articulation of it. It turns out, if you're a Disney shareholder, to have been beautifully profitable too. So one of the problems with strategy, though, is that strategy is very difficult to perceive at the IT project level. And the reason for that is because if it does exist, a singular organizational strategy with goals and objectives, by the time it is chopped up into the standard IT mix of things, it's really only working on bits and pieces, kind of like trying to reassemble the elephant, or do a bad sausage made analogy there, or something along those lines. What it does exist is confused, represents inaccurately, and is often incomplete as well. And so the IT projects don't tend to well reflect what the organizational strategy is in order to do this. The purpose is an essential element of any architecture as well. If you're making an architecture, it exists to solve some purpose, some motivation, and that's what we really need to focus on. So strategy really is about making sure your organization does the same things it does, with a few exceptions. We're going to change a couple of things because we can't change everything at once. A wonderful TED Talk I recommend to you highly is one by Simon Sinek. The link for it is right down here in the bottom of the screen on there, and there should be a live link so that you can just click on it once you get these slides. But Simon points out something that may be obvious after he says it, but still is nevertheless worth repeating. As human beings, we are particularly oftentimes good at describing what we do, but we are less good at describing how we do it, and we tend not to be very good at articulating the why. Well, strategy must provide the why, because if we don't provide the why, nobody understands what we're doing and how we're doing it and what it should be done. What motivates people is not what would you do, but instead why you do it. For example, the Reverend Martin Luther King gave the "I have a dream" speech. He did not give the "I have a plan" speech. Again, just imagine the difference in emphasis. By the way, there's a wonderful sub-story about that particular speech. Catch me offline at a conference upcoming. We'll all be at DGIQ, for example, in the end of April, beginning of May, and I will tell you the rest of that story because it's a really good one. What is strategy now? Well, again, I mentioned that it wasn't really used a lot before about 1950. It tended to be a word that was restricted to just the military use around all of this. But about 1950 or so, the management consultants of the world, the Peter Druckers, discovered it and discovered they could make a lot of money going in and creating lots and lots of complicated diagrams and things around strategy, and have been selling strategy ever since. And you can see from the usage, it's way, way up. Well, this, of course, leads people to think that strategy is simply a thing. In other words, I need that strategy so I can go follow it. Again, not the right way to do it. Going back to the origin of this, and I don't claim to be a great military strategist around this, but I have worked with the military on and off in my career. And the military derivation from the word strategy is a pattern in a stream of decisions. And you can see from the second definition that strategy should be thought of much more as a process than a thing. All right. So let's go and look at a couple of these things as examples. Here is Walmart's former business strategy. I'm sure you all know it. Everyday low prices. This is a very good strategy. Walmart has done literally decades of work making sure that every human being on the planet associates Walmart with everyday low prices. You hear this on the Walmart Express as you're on the commuter jets going out to Bentonville. You hear this as you're talking to people in the stores. You hear it as you're talking to associates and suppliers, et cetera, et cetera. This is a very simple strategy that says when you're making decisions at Walmart, it is real important to keep the organizational strategy in mind, and the organizational strategy is everyday low price. So if you make an error, but you erred on the side of strategy, you will never get disciplined as a result of this. Wonderful, wonderful example of all that. Let's take a second example here. Some of you may or may not be familiar with Wayne Gretzky, although I think our soon-to-be president was mentioning him in a different context recently. But Wayne Gretzky also described a strategy. He skates to where he thinks the puck will be. If you're chasing a hockey puck, which is a very dense piece of plastic around on the ice, which is very slippery, you will never catch it by trailing it and trying to catch up to it. You have to anticipate where it's going to be. Once again, Wayne Gretzky's Wikipedia entry does a great job of elaborating on this particular strategy, including some conversations between he and his dad that are just very illuminating. Let's now move to a military implementation of strategy here, and I'll just take you quickly through Napoleon at Waterloo. If you're not familiar with it, you know it didn't end well, but it's still taught as a very good example of strategic thinking in most military war colleges around the world here. So the question comes up, how do I defeat the competition when their forces are bigger than mine? Now, just to give you a slight bit of context here, Napoleon's forces were in blue, the French Corps in the lower part of the diagram, the map that's on the board there. And the British, they were facing the British, which were in red, and the Prussian troops, which were in black on this particular map. And the answer, of course, is divide and conquer. Notice again, it relies on the pattern in a stream of decisions that we're working with as our definition of strategy. So to observe the battlefield here, as Napoleon did at this particular point in time, he looked at the lines of supply. You may have heard the phrase, an army marches on its stomach. Well, in this case, the Red Army, the British, were supplied out of Ostend on the on the Belgian coast, and the Prussians were supplied out of Liege. You can see they are in two different parts. And Napoleon observed that if they were in two different parts and he hit these two organizations in the middle, two armies in the middle, he would in fact be able to divide them. So this was the first part of his strategy. Hit them really hard so that they will separate. Again, bash them really hard so that they will separate, they will fall back, because when they fall back, they will tend to run toward safety, as in food, as opposed to away from safety. He had a two-part strategy, however. His second part of the strategy was divide and then conquer. Now, if you have an army of blue, you have to tell the army of blue which way they're going to do it. Napoleon wanted everybody in his blue army to turn to the right and defeat the Prussians before everybody then turning to the left and defeating the British. So now you see exactly what he meant by divide and conquer. And I want to just point out to you that that is a relatively complex strategy. I'll summarize it again very briefly. First, hit both armies hard at just the right spot. And then everybody turn to the right and defeat the Prussians. And then everybody turn to the left and defeat the British. Gets an A for strategy. The execution part was a little bit difficult because remember, not only do you have to do all of this, but you have to do this while somebody is trying to kill you. Okay, so this counts as a complex strategy. And he was not, in fact, able to pull it off, unfortunately. A couple more examples here real quick, just a strategy idea. If we're the good guys on the left and the bad guys are over here on the right, we're going to employ one set of strategic constructs here, as opposed to if we are occupying the high ground and the bad guys are down here on the right in the low ground, or different again still if the bad guys are occupying the high ground and we're down here on the low ground. So again, Strategy is a pattern in a stream of decisions, and most importantly, for your purposes. Most of you are not involved in military operations. Strategy guides your work group activities. When work groups sit around and think about things, strategy is what they think about. They do not go to the bookshelf. Strategy that winds up on a bookshelf where we say, oh my gosh, I need to go something strategically. I'm going to go find the strategy binder and pull it down and read it. You've already lost the battle at that point in time. In fact, one of our generals that later became president, Dwight Eisenhower, said it best. In preparing for battle, I've always found that plans are useless, but that planning is indispensable. And that concept here of planning is really, really key. Mike Tyson, also in the news recently, but still with a very famous quote, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. Well, once again, this makes perfectly good sense. The reality of the battle is such that you need people to think strategically and to be able to look at a pattern in a stream of decisions as opposed to following a 100-page or 600 PowerPoint deck in order to do these things. So let's talk about now what a data strategy is. Data strategy is that pattern in a stream of decisions, the highest level of data guidance that's available, that focuses data activities on business goal achievement. What are the things we're trying to accomplish, and how can we use data to better accomplish them that provide guidance when faced with these streams of uncertainty or decisions that are made? The data strategy most usefully articulates how data can be best used to support organizational strategy and involves a balance of proactive and reactive measures in order to do that. Most data strategies are able to be measured from some perspective. The effectiveness of it is what happens over time. Are we in fact achieving the things we're attempting to achieve in strategy with data? They should be volume-wise relatively short. Certainly should not be the case that your data strategy is larger or longer than your organizational strategy. There should be versions of your strategy. It's very important to label your strategy as version 1, because when you put it out there as strategy version 1, when you evolve that strategy to version 2, people won't go, wait a minute, I already have my data strategy, which is of course not the way to think of it. The key is that version 1 of the strategy, hit them hard in the middle, is going to run until we've split the two armies apart. Then of course we turn to the right, and that's where we go to strategy version 2, and strategy version 3 is turn around and hit them on the left. We can also measure the understanding of this, that people have good agreement or not around these various topics. Now, what you'd probably like to have, and I want to say thanks to my good friend and colleague, Dr. Chris Bradley here, who puts something together like this on a regular basis for organizations, but it takes you about 5 to 7 years of working with these things to actually get them to the point where they are useful here. So I label this document as aspirational, not operational, because most organizations have no idea what are the major things they need to measure with in here. So keep this around for a reference. Remember, you get all copies of the slides, but you won't be able to implement it just that way. In fact, when we think about the sort of traditional way most people are sold strategy, how it comes out of books and things like that, you need to plan the entire operation before beginning. And that means that you know exactly what's going to happen, what are the upfront assumptions, because you know what the end objectives need to be. Instead, the better way is to use iterative strategic cycles that incorporate feedback that can help correct and keep things on track, as opposed to betting on your initial assumptions all the way through. And as you do this from a strategic cyclic perspective, over time, the capacity and the ability to increase your capacity and improve your operations improves. And the focus changes from a reactive to a proactive type of an approach in order to do this. Now, I get approached all the time with my consulting hat on, and people say, all right, I want you to help me with these data strategies. Well, these are a sampling of the strategies that are offered to me. Yes, big data, data science, analytics, these are technologies. These are not strategies. And they do not help in that sense. So let's just sit back for a minute and recap the first sort of third of this piece. A data strategy specifies how data assets are to be used to support strategy. We've talked about what is strategy, what's a data strategy, and how they work together. The idea is the strategy evolves periodically. So I may have a number of things in my environment. I've just labeled some random words up there at the top, but these are all constraints that are limiting strategic goal achievement in here. And that our strategic focus then comes in and says, let's pick space as the first one. And I'm going to, just playing a video game, focus in on it and eliminate it as a constraint. And then the second cycle, I'm going to focus on cost and zap it from that perspective. This is how strategy should best be applied under these circumstances. So we move out of the first chunk and into the second. The data strategy is necessary for effective data governance. This is so you can improve your organization's data, but you can't just improve the data. You also have to improve the way people use that data. We have 7 data governance definitions here, including the one that is authorized by our Dimbach on here. I don't like any of these. I'm sorry, but I hope I gave you enough time to read them. Don't worry, again, you do get the slides in order to do this, but I want you to think of an elevator pitch. And of course, the elevator pitch is the idea that somebody's getting on the elevator and the boss shows up and says, down at my badge and says, hey, Peter, you work for me. Tell me, what is a data strategy? Or what is data governance? Well, if I'm trying to explain as a system of things and blah, 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 I'm not going to have a good conversation. We need to have a good, simple definition of what data governance is. And the idea here is data governance is managing data with guidance. Now, most people say, oh, well, would you want your sole non-depletable, non-degrading, durable strategic asset managed without guidance? No, of course you wouldn't. I change this definition slightly when I'm talking to the C-suite, because then it becomes managing data decisions with guidance. And this is equally as important to understand here, because most people are making data decisions, but they're not realizing the decisions they're making are impacting the data. Now, when you look at this from the outside of us chickens that are interested enough to spend an hour working on this in the middle of a January Tuesday here, there's everything else data. We've got data management, data governance, and unfortunately what most people hear outside of this, they really don't get it. And so it's best just to talk about your data program as a whole. That includes your strategy, your governance, anything else that you happen to be doing within there, but it's easier for people to get what it is that's happening, because data today is an asset that is different from our standard assets. Data, as I mentioned before, is our sole non-depletable, non-degrading, durable strategic asset, as opposed to our financial, real estate, or inventory assets, and many other types of assets that can't happen there. Data assets really win when you compare them, because these other things can be used up, can degrade over time, et cetera, et cetera. Many people say that data is the new oil. While that's a wonderful term, I don't like it, because oil doesn't tend to be focused on reusability. Whereas if I just change one letter there and add the word, the S to the word oil and make it soil, we can now talk about data as really being something useful in 2 ways in particular. One, we don't just throw seeds about the yard when we're doing this work. We actually carefully prepare the soil and create a bed for the things to grow in. And the second part is we recognize the time dimension here. We don't plant things on Monday and expect to eat them on Friday, even if we do happen to live downwind from Chernobyl. Of course, you need some sizzle to be able to sell that as well. So there's got to be something that attracts people to it. And we have a lot of hype in this industry as it is anyway. But as a non-typical asset, data deserves its own strategy. It deserves attention on par with similar organizational assets, and it requires professional administration to make up for past neglect. I'll give you an example of that past neglect here, where in 2020, there's the link to the article in Forbes magazine here. American Airlines was valued at $6 billion and United Airlines was valued at $9 billion. Well, the data in the American Airlines Advantage program was valued between $20 and $30 billion. And the data in the United program was valued at twice the value of the company. You better believe that the CEOs of these organizations trying their hardest to realize, to monetize the value that's there. And of course, not doing a great job of it, or else we would see the value of these organizations increase considerably on this. And this is mainly due to data debt. Data debt, unfortunately, helps us to prevent what's happening in data. It slows our progress, it decreases the quality that we have, it increases the costs that we're dealing with, and it presents greater risks in order to do this. One of the problems with data debt is that there is, in fact, so much data, and we have to separate the wheat, the good stuff, from the chaff, the bad stuff in the data. Looking at it from that perspective, one of the questions that you're going to get asked, first of all, is well-organized data worth more? And there's a very simple answer here provided by a wonderful author. I'll give you the information in just a second here, but the Abby Covert, and what she talks about is, imagine having a book, and that book not being bound, but in fact, we rip the spine off the back of that book and we distribute the pages. We don't have things like page numbers and table of contents and things. The data, the information in that book becomes ephemeral very, very quickly. So better organized data clearly increases in value. And now you know how to articulate that as well, but you also have to understand that 80% of the data that you have in your organization is rot. Rot is an acronym standing for data that is redundant, obsolete, or trivial. And the question becomes, how do I eliminate that most of that data? Most organizational data is never touched in any way, shape, or form. Consequently, it's really sort of problematic in that sense. So who is best qualified to actually separate the wheat from the chaff here? Well, again, these are going to be your data stewards in the context of your data governance organization. Organizational strategy, recall, is solely to support the organization's achievement of strategy from the data perspective. However, data strategy needs to be governed by a strategy. Data governance needs to be governed by a strategy. And the question is, what are the data assets doing to better support the strategy, and how well is that strategy working? We then need to drop down into IT projects. How is the data delivered by IT? We can throw in some operational constraints. How does IT support strategy, and make sure we've got the appropriate feedback loops in there? And it looks like a very nice picture showing that clearly data strategy plays a key role tying together the organizational strategy with the data governance efforts that are going on in the organization. But it needs to be a little bit more specific than that. Again, if I take this and add in our data stewards in here, that's perfectly good. But our data assets are need to be expressed in terms of business goals, specific, understandable business goal achievement here. And also that our strategy, our language of organizational data governance, has to be the language of metadata in order to support this. And both of these need to be present in our communication between our data governance organization and our stewards, so that our stewards can best represent it to the rest of the community in order to come up with these things. So little brief minutes here describing the role of data strategy as related to data governance. Strategy guides governance. Now we're going to talk about the prerequisites. Everybody goes, great, I'd like to do the strategy. I think it's a wonderful thing. Let's get started. And unfortunately, they run flat out into a brick wall because most organizations have a lack of organizational readiness. They don't understand how they have to compensate for the preparedness that they need to develop. And instead, these lack of data competencies become problematic. And I pull them all together in something I call the 7 deadly data sins. So let's look at data strategy framework. This is part 1 of 2. I'll give you the second part in just a few more minutes. But the first part is pretty straightforward. Organization comes in with some business needs. Perhaps they have an organizational mission, some strategies, some objectives, organizational structures, performance measures, and the consultants grab those needs and turn them into a solution, right? Well, unfortunately, that is the wrong way to do it.
This is wrong.
Thank you, Morgan Freeman, for allowing me to do a little sample there. Yes, exactly. Not the right way to do it. Instead, what we need to do is temper those business needs with where is the organization at in its state of maturity. And let me give you an example. Many of you might have a Tesla or might be familiar with a Tesla, and it's we're just recovering from an east coast of the United States snowstorm. But I want you to imagine handing the fob to your Tesla to a 16-year-old driver and saying, go out there and learn how to drive in the snow by yourself. Well, we shouldn't expect good results. Nothing against Teslas or snow, but putting them together and just telling people good luck is not the way to do it. And that's similar to the way most organizations do strategy. It just doesn't work. You have to have a match between the organizational capabilities and the business needs. And that requires a little bit of subsetting in order to do this, to come up with some specific business value targets, capacity targets, tactics, and some data strategic vision in order to do this. So we divide data strategy into two phases. The first phase is eliminating the prerequisites, making sure that you are ready to do this. They are prepare for dramatic change, determine how to do the work, recruit a qualified, knowledgeable enterprise data executive, most people call it chief data officer, and eliminate those 7 deadly data sins. Then we'll go to phase 2, but we'll do that in just a minute. So starting out here with dramatic change, it is a very new environment. We used to have these topics called CIOs. I've only been involved in developing 2 sets of federal regulation, but I did in fact help with the original creation of the CIO language, which was the federal government's way of just saying that we need to have one throat to choke from an IT perspective, and that data, of course, was clearly part of that. Well, 40 years later, we do understand that data is not best when it's reporting to the chief information officer, that we do need to have an enterprise data executive to do this. And here's a fairly good description of a chief data officer job. I'm certainly not going to read it to you. Instead, I'll give you some highlights, but I also note that there are more chief digital officers out there than there are chief data officers. So we have a ways to go as a CDO community to actually come up with this. So this is the same definition, but just highlighting the points. Senior leadership, you've got to be reporting into that C-suite at the same level that your other resource managers, such as HR and finance, are reporting into. That the CDO's purview encompasses every knowledge worker in the entire enterprise, not just the IT people, not just the data people, but every knowledge worker in there, because this is where you're going to get the biggest lift in potential improvements in your organization. That the CDO establishes fiduciary responsibilities. And this is a relatively new concept for many people, but the idea is that we have certain relationships with our health professionals, with our financial professionals, with other professionals that we have that have a duty to, in fact, keep these pieces of data that we have safe in order to do this. So the fiduciariness of the data TDO job is important in there, and that we do have to get rid of the data debt in most cases, become healthy as an organization perspective in order to do this, and that we need to focus in on providing value on a regular basis. I have so many groups that I've worked with that did great things 10 years ago, but management sitting around tapping their foot, looking at their watch and saying, I know you did some great things 10 years ago, but what have you done for me lately? And we do need to make sure that happens. So the whole introduction of a chief data officer into organizations has been very disruptive in most cases. In fact, when my book was translated into Chinese, it came out to be the title Chief Data Officer Combat. So it's clearly somebody who's reading between the lines there, I think, correctly in order to do this. Adding a CDO to an existing CIO is exactly working out halfway. Half of the time, the CIO says, great, I wasn't doing much with this data. I can tell it's your problem now. Here you go. Good luck, right? And get rolling on that particular piece. The other half of them going, wait a minute, what am I, chopped liver? There's a good deal of resistance around all of that. So again, we have a very, very interesting piece that we're having here, which results in a lot of confusion, doubt, uncertainty, resentment, and resistance, as Mario Farah so eloquently described in his article, also in Forbes. What we do need to understand, though, is that making changes to an organization is not something that is new or not understood. In fact, we have had a discipline called change management and leadership for many, many years. And that only when we have these various pieces line up correctly can we, in fact, get true organizational change, which is not a data problem. It's not an IT problem. It's an organizational behavioral problem. So we're eventually going to have to explain to our kids what a physical lock was, because, of course, this is clearly not an electronic lock. But nevertheless, when I go into organizations and I see vision, skills, incentive, and action plan, I will also see frustration because they are lacking the resources. If I see vision, incentive, resources, and an action plan, I will see anxiety because they don't have the skills. If I see skills, incentive, resources, and an action plan, I will see confusion because they don't have the vision. If I see vision, skills, resources, and an action plan, I will see gradual change because there's no incentive. We have to make it easier to do it the new way than it is to do it the old way. And finally, the last version of this is vision, skills, incentive, and resources without an action plan. I'll see a bunch of false starts. Only when all of these things are together are we actually going to achieve the change we need to have, and culture continues to be the biggest impediment to a shift in organizational thinking about data. If you have an interest in learning more about that, I have a wonderful case study that has gotten a lot of attention over the years. I've actually had more than a dozen companies come to me and say, how did you find out so much about our company that you could write this case study up and get permission to do it? Well, of course, it's not about any one company, but it is about many companies that have gotten into this particular situation. So we've talked about change, and we've talked about how to do the work in there. Now we're going to talk about getting a hold of a knowledgeable enterprise data executive. And I just want you to think, who hires the enterprise data executive? It's the board. Now, I'm going to deviate here for just a quick second to talk about another board-related activity that was made for, first of all, a wonderful reading book. We're not in the summertime yet, it's January, but nevertheless, Kurt Eichenwald's book is a great book to take with you to the beach and read about Conspiracy of Fools, which obviously had to do with the Enron Corporation. Now, for those of you that don't recall the story, the Enron Corporation was named America's most innovative company for 6 consecutive years. That's a pretty large amount of praise heaped on a company that in the summer of 2001 suffered the largest Chapter 11 bankruptcy in history up to that point in time. In August of 2001, the price had dropped from $90 a share to $42 to 26 cents a share. Can you get a sense that things were going poorly at Enron in the summer of 2001? Yes, of course. What happened was Dynergy, a company that hadn't yet gotten the joke, came to Enron and said, hey, we'll help rescue you. We'll get several $billion cash. It's clearly just a temporary cash shortage that you have. There must be something good underneath there that you've done. And they put several $billion of money into it. Now, I'm not a person who should be lecturing you on relationship management, but I have learned that if you're going to have conversations with people you care about, it's good to have conversations with money about them before you get highly involved in them. And the Enron company took the several $billion that Dynergy had given them and spent the entire amount in a week. You might say to yourself, how does one spend $1 billion in a week? Well, it's quite easy when any person can write a check for any amount of money for any purchase at any point in time. And yes, you should be saying, I'm sorry, this doesn't seem like good fiscal management. And of course it isn't. But at this point, it was too late. And Enron went back to Dynergy at the end of the week and said, we need some more money. And Dynergy said, what happened to the several $billion I gave you last week? And Enron said, I don't know. Again, this is all well documented both in the book, as a wonderful Wikipedia article on it as well, and it's led to some improved standards around the topic of a chief financial officer. There are objective qualifications, sometimes including CPA designation, sometimes a master's of accountancy, other recognized certificates. And this is understood to be necessary but insufficient prerequisites for managing the finances of a large corporation. In Enron's instance, their chief financial officer was making tens of millions of dollars from his side projects and only $500,000 a year in his salary from Enron. Of course, where is his allegiance going to be? He's going to pay attention to the things that are earning him tens of millions as opposed to the thing that was earning him $500,000. And that divided loyalty became something that we've actually written laws around to say you can't do that anymore. And we have to do it a different way. But what we have understood is that there are necessary objective characteristics of a chief financial officer. We don't have them in place. In fact, we don't have data education in place. Now, my definition of a knowledge worker is somebody who works with data. In others, I contend that 100% of knowledge workers work with data and have to have a literacy component in there, but we teach them nothing about this, and then they all deal with it. This is terrible. What's even worse is that IT professionals are still, even today's environment around the world, given one course in data, typically how to build a new database. And the impressions that IT professionals get is that IT does not really need to understand much about data except when you're developing a new database. So if I'm merging two ERPs together, that's not creating a new database. If I'm in the process of shutting down or optimizing an existing database or installing an ERP. None of these things need data skills that are in there, and we haven't gotten them. In fact, if the only skill you know how to use is a hammer, the only tool you know how to use is a hammer, then every problem tends to look like a nail, and building new databases is probably the last skill we need more of on planet Earth. As a result, many organizations have made bad data decisions. Not surprising in here, because when we look at what actually is happening here, we have something called a bad data decision spiral. Data decision makers are not data knowledgeable, and these are technical decision makers are not data knowledgeable. And this leads us up to bad data decisions that are made all the time, which results in poor treatment of organizational assets and poor quality data, leading to, of course, poor quality outcomes. And of course, the problem we have is that we're trapped in a spiral. We don't know how to get out of this.
This is wrong.
Once again, thank you, Morgan Freeman, for a wonderful sample there. Yes, this is absolutely wrong. And in fact, if we look at the situation facing a company that's very good at this process, Salesforce.com, many organizations that I've worked with have a mandate to install Salesforce.com by a date certain, some date that IT has picked and that IT has driven. And that what happens when we install the software is that it becomes imperative on us just to forklift the data into Salesforce. And that results in Salesforce, which is good software, being filled with bad fuel, garbage in, garbage out. And people unfortunately can't tell the difference. So they say Salesforce doesn't work well. Well, of course, Salesforce does work well, but it's bad data decisions that are causing this to happen. And the problem is that we have nobody in most organizations that focuses exclusively on data. Let's again look at how this works from our C levels. The chief is the head. The chief financial officer is the person who makes the financial decisions. The risk officer incorporates risk. The chief medical officer focuses on medical. I could go on, but notice what happens here is that the CFO does not balance the books, the CRO does not test software, and the CMO doesn't do surgery. They're focused instead on how these assets are employed by the organization in order to do this. So how do you hire a chief data officer, a data leader, when you don't have people that know what data is or anything about it? And the answer is you should go somewhere else and find other people to help you. Even most recruiting firms, I find, are not really good. And the average CDO is lasting only 18 months out there. That's a similar trajectory to what CIOs had. CIOs now last between 2 to 4 years out there, but it's still a problem area. So all organizations are going to need something at the top level that's a top data job, an enterprise data executive, a chief data officer, I don't care what you call it, to manage the data governance organization, to liaison with IT, but focused exclusively on data asset leveraging, unconstrained by an IT project mindset and reporting to the business. Absent this, your data strategy has no chance of gaining any traction whatsoever. And even with these things in place, I mentioned before, the CDOs are not lasting a long time, right? It's a very big problem. They tend not to be successful. We're going to continue to work on that, but now we need to look just very briefly at the 7 deadly data sins that the CDO should be approaching as their first strategic pieces. And the second one is lacking data leadership. So we need to find not just the person leading this, but also others in the organization who are effectively able to help the organization do some thinking around data and figuring out how they can use data in better support of organizational strategy. They need to develop a robust programmatic means of sharing data. They need to make sure that the data program is aligned with IT projects. They need to manage expectations around it. They need to make sure that we implement strategy in a way that allows us to do things that are saving money before we do things that are innovative. That's a very simple guidance there. And of course, you have to pay attention to the cultural and change management challenges. But the number one thing people don't understand is what is data-centric thinking. And I've done some work in this area inspired by the agile doctrine. This is derived straight from it. We're uncovering better ways of developing IT systems by doing it and helping others do it. Through this work, we've come to value data programs driving IT programs, informed information investing over IT acquisition activities, that shared and stable organizational data is more valuable than IT component evaluation, and the data reuse is much more valuable than the acquisition of new data sources. That is, while there is value with the items on the right, we value items on the left more. By the way, that is all of the original guidance that the organizational change strategy and the agile agile manifesto. I quote on that one. Sorry, guys. The agile manifesto put out there in order to do this. Very simple guidance. This guidance can work for you all as well. Let's value the things on the left more than things on the right. Now, that's hard decisions. That's where it gets into some of the organizational clashes that I've talked about before. But nevertheless, it is absolutely worthwhile to do this, make sure that people agree that that's the direction we're going and the things that we need to do. Data programs over IT, informed information investing over technology acquisition, stable shared organizational data over IT component evaluation, and data reuse over the acquisition of new data sources. All right, so we're almost at the end here now. We've got a little bit more to go. Again, well, so Peter, you've told us all the things we need to do to get ready, and that's certainly quite a lot, and I agree it is quite a lot. But now that we are ready to implement data strategy, let's talk a little bit about how that works. So we're now ready to go, and you'll notice I'm using the words lather, rinse, and repeat. Excuse me, we're right here at this point, and it turns out to be a fairly straightforward process where we have 5 steps. And these steps might look familiar to some of you because they are based on something that hopefully you're very familiar with. To introduce this, I'm going to go back a little bit. Remember, we started out with our data strategy framework where we said the business needs and just coming up with a solution without understanding where the business was at, what they were capable of ingesting, absorbing, maturely implementing was a mistake. And that's certainly the case. But now, in order to get past our roadmap and actually start implementing our strategy, we have to look at a balance of activities. If everything that I'm doing tends to produce new business value, I'm never going to develop the organizational capabilities that I need to have in order to do this. And if I spend all my time developing organizational capabilities, I'm never going to come up with business value. So you in your organization have to find the right balance between the two of these things. It was said very well by one of the CDOs that I've interviewed for my next book coming out on this. She said, we know how to do this. We don't know how to do it for your organization. You're the best experts at how to do this for this organization. Our goal here at Dataversity and DAMA International is to give you those skills that you need to have in order to do this. Because when you look at what's guidance around here by the books, they say that your data strategy should really be a combination of your accumulation of your data strategy from your governance perspective, your metadata strategy, your data quality strategy, your BI strategy. I won't read all these, you get the picture. And most organizations don't have these, or if they do have them, they have them at such a level of detail it's impossible to reconcile them all together.
This is wrong.
Once again, Morgan Freeman, thank you very much. Yes, this is absolutely wrong. Instead, remember, a strategy has to evolve periodically, focusing on one thing at a time. Get rid of space, and we're going to do it in a 5-step process. That way, data debt is reduced, and it determines what is most fixable in order to do that. Then, of course, we need to focus back in on the next piece of it, whatever that happens to be. And we'll work in strategic cycle number 2, where it's cost. Bam, we're going to zap that one too by applying the same technique to it. Hopefully this makes sense to you. I found it works very, very well for most organizations. And when I mentioned it might sound familiar, many of you have encountered this particular book called The Goal. Elihu Olderot did a wonderful job of describing this particular book. He sold millions and millions of copies of it. I am a believer as well. He's even had it made into a movie or a wonderful audiobook in here. And in The Goal, he describes something called the theory of constraints, which is to say that in our organization, data is often the weak link in the chain, that the theory of constraints allows us to become stronger by fixing the weak links in the chain, in this case through the adventures of Alex Rogo and the Unico environment. Again, those of you that remember it might have some fond memories. It's a great book on here, but if you don't, it's told in a very, very narrative way. Wonderful way of describing this. Each of the cycles that we go through has a specific articulated purpose. And the cycles that he describes in the book, in the generic way, are the theory of constraint. To identify the current constraints, the components in the system that are limiting goal realization. Then we go to, oops, I'm so sorry, I'm going to go back there. Then we go to next on this, coming up with the idea that we have to exploit that constraint, make decisions about how best to take that constraint and make it work for us rather than against us, that you need to organizationally work more effectively and increase the capacity of the system in light of demands and non-constraints. And if that doesn't work, you repeat the process until the constraint is eliminated. So let's move this into data talk now. Again, taking out of his original piece, we identify how your organization can support it. What's the one thing that's blocking you most from it? It may be data quality, but in all likelihood, it's a combination of some factors. You need to pick one, determine how best to exploit that constraint, harness excess capacity of the non-constraints, alleviate that the constraint by restructuring to further increase or support these capacities. Repeat until the strategy actually supports this. And again, just like it says on the shampoo bottle, lather, rinse, and repeat. Now, if that looks suspiciously like something called plan, do, act, and check, plan, do, check, and act, it should. It's the longer I'm fairly old, you guys, the longer I've been around, the more all of methods and methodologies look like plan, do, check, act to me. And I think that's incredibly important to understand in here. Let me just give you a very specific example on this. We may start off with a example where we're trying to implement something in the way of getting access to better data. And we need a three-legged stool in order to do this. So we're going to take 3 of the Dimbach wedges that we have around here. In this case, I've highlighted data warehousing, data quality, and organizational data governance. And we've gotten so far, but now we've discovered we need to evolve our strategy a mite. And we're still going to be focusing in on data strategy, but now we're looking at metadata management. We get 2 experience points for governance and warehousing, but we now have done some data quality and some metadata management. The third version of this is one that's likely to get us the results, where we've now discovered reference and master data management, but gotten 3 experience points in data governance and data warehousing, which allows us to sort of very quickly mature our organization as we're moving upwards in that particular chain. In addition to that, you've got to keep in mind value chain analysis. And this is a well-established category of saying, what are the things that allow us to take data and turn it into value for the organization? People keep rediscovering monetization. Again, Doug Laney's book's been out for well over a decade. I've had one out for 15 years on these ideas, but the knowledge workers that are there give you a minimum of a 10x multiplier when you're trying to do this. So make sure that you keep in mind value around all of these topics, because the value that you're producing, and if people are thinking in terms of value, are much easier to come up with. It's just a matter of changing slightly how you think about these things and then repeating it. Again, one of our wonderful CDOs that we have in the new book, it says looking at it through data eyes, right? So we're going to start incorporating that language, because once we've done that, remember, our strategic cycles allow us to over time increase the capacity and improve our operations, but also focus from reactive to proactive types of activities on this. And then if we get really good at the strategic cycle, we can actually start to spin off these things in parallel and set multiple efforts in play so that we can move more quickly throughout the entire life cycle, going through and eliminating data debt and creating data value for our organizations. So I'm going to spend a few minutes here summarizing just to get us to the end and to the Q&A section here, but I think I had a lot of fun putting this one together. A data strategy specifies how data assets are to be used to support the organizational strategy. Very clear, no unambiguity about it. The data strategy is subordinate to the organizational strategy. I see so many of these that are off in the wrong direction or that are not tightly integrated with them, and that's really a mistake. So to do that properly, you have to understand what is strategy. And I hope through this program, you've now understood that strategy should be thought of more as a process rather than a thing. And that the data strategy then says, in order to support that strategic process, we also need strategic data processes or practices in order to do this correctly, because they have to work together. If they're not working together, you're wasting organizational resources all the way around on this. And that a data strategy is necessary for effective data governance. When I look at how Laura Madsen and others are critiquing the state of data governance in today's environment, I think they're very valid, because they're having lots of meetings but not getting enough done. Whereas if it's focused specifically on how governance can best help take the data of the organization and use it in support of the strategy, we'll have a much better success rate on this. The key is not just to improve your organization's data, although that is certainly a component of it, but you need to improve the way people use their data. And most have not got the requisite knowledge and skills in order to do this. This speaks to a tremendous need for data literacy out there, not just among your data scientists and your cyber professionals, but in fact, among all of your knowledge workers in your organization. They all need data literacy at a certain measurable level in order to do this, because only by improving your data and improving the way people use that data can you now help the organization use its data to better support its organizational strategy. There are some specific data strategy prerequisites. There's a lack of organizational readiness, which is a culture problem. There's a failure to compensate for data competencies, and that is a literacy problem. And then there are some specific data barriers to achieving data nirvana. There are 7 deadly data sins that I've gone over in there that you need to have addressed as well. And that data strategy is evolving in 2 phases. The first one is to eliminate the prerequisites that are up there. And the second phase is a lather, rinse, and repeat phase. That we do some data strategy, we fix something in the organization, and then we stop and reassess, and then we come back and do it again. Once again, if this is difficult to read, obviously I've got a book on it that's there, but if you really want to get the essence of what's happening in there, the goal as a strategy book is out there on Amazon. I think last time I looked, it was $5 a copy. So they've got so many used copies. Nothing wrong with buying a used copy, having it shipped to your house, or listening to the audiobook version of it, which is done in a play format and very, very creatively done there as well. Key also that I emphasized is that you can't focus exclusively on increasing capabilities, because if you do that, you'll increase capabilities to the exclusion of demonstrating business value. If you focus on business value, then you'll demonstrate business value to the exclusion of understanding organizational capability. So a balanced approach is required, and that you need to have these data value chains in place. They won't be the right ones the first time you do it, but if you start to incorporate them as over this process, they will get better over time, and you'll become ever better able to do things with your data that you haven't been able to do. So as we get ready for our Q&A section, let me just go back to a bottom line up front, which I really didn't do, so it's probably bad to call it bottom line up front. Multiple dozen-page data strategies are really not useful than the process of creating them, especially at first as you do this. If you work over time, you can eventually get to that really nice, crisp articulation of it that Chris Bradley lent us a page for in there in order to do that. And that most organizations spend way too much time trying to write a perfect plan at the expense of equal efforts required to become proficient at implementing data strategically on this. And finally, cycling through a series of improvements is a much better way to think about data strategy than a grand plan that's going to take you 5 years in order to get there. So we're right back at the top of the hour. A quick plug for my books. Again, the newest one Todd and I have out is something called Beyond Bytes, which talks about ethical data monetization in the digital age. And we'll invite you guys back in to now start with our Q&A session. Shannon, how's it going?
Going so well, Peter. Thank you so much for kicking off the year with such a great webinar, as always. So exciting to continue this series, our oldest series that we've been producing at Dataversity. If you have questions for Peter, feel free to put them in the Q&A panel and just answer the most commonly asked questions. Just a reminder, I will send a follow-up email by end of day Thursday to all registrants with links to the slides and links to the recording. In here, Peter. Right off from the beginning, there's a question about the Disney strategy diagram. Is that a conceptual data model?
Excellent question. I can pretty much guess who's actually done that. Let me put it back up to get there. Whoops, hang on. I'm having trouble pulling the diagram up. I think it certainly could be a candidate conceptual data model for whoever asked that question. It was not done that way in 1957. My understanding is that the people at Disney simply sat down on the back of a napkin and said, well, how are we going to make money? And they said, well, we're going to have some creative talent. We're going to produce films, and those films are going to have merchandising associated with them. And some of those films are going to turn into TV shows and TV commercials. And some of those films are going to spin off music in order to do this. Can anybody spell wicked these days? There's going to be publications. There's a Walt Disney magazine. I have not actually seen a Walt Disney magazine, but certainly there were comic strips. All of these things reinforced back and forth the various activities that they're doing. And you can see almost everything in their strategy is out there. Even in 1957, they were looking at reissues. So one of the things Disney does on a regular basis is they'll take Snow White, just to take one example, off the market for a little bit. And people will it'll build up some demand. So when they put it back out at a higher price point than they had it before, they make more money off of an existing product. It's a great example of data reuse in the maximal sense. Now, if you were actually going to critique this from a logical data model perspective, I think they've labeled all the relationships. Certainly, it's clear that each of those would need a key attribute to be able to identify a unique one individually. I think the short answer to that is yes. That could be very, very much the basis for a good logical data model. What a great question to start us off with. Thanks.
Indeed, I love it. So, Peter, which are the key data drivers that you recommend to focus the data strategy?
Well, that's really where we've got to come back in and look at the organizational strategy. And so I'm going to jump back to the slides here that talk about strategy, right? In Walmart's instance, and again, I'm not giving anything secret, all this has appeared in Harvard Business Review before, but my 3 years with the company allowed me to see how they actually live and breathe this process. So they start off with, what is it that we're trying to achieve here? What do we want to be known as? This little tiny company from Bentonville, Arkansas. And the answer was everyday low price. And that pattern in a stream of decisions drives everything else that organization does. And it does it beautifully. Now, whether you like Walmart or don't like Walmart, I'm not going to get into that part of it. But as far as doing data management, man, those guys are absolutely king of the hills. The US government goes regularly to Walmart and tries to learn about things. So the business drivers are going to be the things that allow them to have everyday low price. And I can tell a quick little story here that's kind of interesting. While I was at Walmart on site, Dilbert, back in the days when it was still politically acceptable to read Dilbert, talk about him. Wally got an assignment to go out and create a social network for their supply chain. And of course, they were all making fun of it, including the Dilbert characters, because they said, Wally's, I remember very well, said, of all my projects, I like the ones that can never succeed the most because I can work on them and nobody will know whether I'm doing anything or not about them. So again, keep this in mind, a social network for supply chain. Now, if you know anything about Walmart's business, one of the things that they do is that they work very carefully with data. If you're going to sell Walmart carrots, then they will go and give you the last 10 years of carrot sales data at each of their stores and say, go away and come back and tell us how we're both going to make more money selling more carrots next year, right? And they'll do this to many people and they'll get the best ideas that all come to them and they'll pick the best ones and implement them. So kind of a great crowdsourcing model before crowdsourcing was even acknowledged as a good way of doing business. Well, while I was there, I found out that Walmart was implementing a system that would make all of these conversations only occur. In other words, the retail data was only going to be shared within a social network. And what Walmart had realized was that the carrot suppliers could get together outside of Walmart walls and collude and try and figure out how they could work with Walmart, but create a more advantageous position for the carrot sellers where Walmart was not holding all of the cards. And so this social network chain was Walmart's attempt to own the conversations about the supply chain, not just the supply chain itself. Again, brilliant piece of strategic work there. They were able to implement that, and in fact, did it the same way as Ford now wants to claim that they own all of the conversations that happen in the cockpit of your car. So when you ask about the strategic drivers, the drivers have to be the things that the organization itself is focusing on. And if you can figure out what those are, it's a much better way of approaching it. Oftentimes, when I work with organizations, I'll find out that they are not really clear what their existing strategy is. And so we have to take a sort of a step back and make sure that strategy is right, because you can't create a data strategy supporting the strategy if the strategy is a wet noodle. All right. I think I've answered that question, Shannon. Really great question, though. Thanks for asking that.
Yeah, there's really some great questions coming in here. We've got plenty of time, so keep them coming. Um, Peter, is in an environment of running business and projects being evolved, what metrics do you apply to review where you are in the applied data strategy?
Great question. So most organizations, again, are managing their projects in an IT format. I want to pull that slide back up here again. Sorry for jumping around. Don't watch the screen. There we go. And I'll just put this on the screen here and talk about it. So when we talk about trying to figure out what's happening at an IT project, one of the things that is really difficult about data is that it doesn't fit into a project management discipline. And the primary reason it doesn't fit in is because a project, by definition, those of you that have your PMP certifications, et cetera, on this, know that every project, by definition, has to have a beginning and an end. Well, this creates some challenges around here, because by the time you get down to a project, the data is probably flowing sideways through some or more of these, different little boxes that I'm showing here on the screen. And so it's a little bit difficult to try and say, hey, how do we, in this case, fit these things in? This is why organizational IT has gotten so disconnected from organizational strategy. And in the past, we used to say, and therefore the data strategy needs to support the organizational strategy. Needs to support the IT strategy. And of course, we don't want that to be the case either. We want them to be exist on a parallel level in this case. So it's perfectly appropriate for an IT strategy to be focused on projects. It is inappropriate for a data strategy to be focused at a project-oriented discipline in order to do that. Again, great question here. And again, it's just a mismatch between this, but it's us as society figuring out over time that these are better ways of doing this. And the better way of doing it in this case is to say the organizational strategy has to be driven by the data strategy, and the data strategy has to have some types of measurables in it. That's, I know, what the original question was. So the question, if you go back into the goal here, again, the stuff we had at the end, and where are we on this? The real measurement is not in terms of where you are in the cycle, but how many of these cycles have you gone round? So the idea is we find a data challenge, we identify it, we try to fix it, we do some things to try and make sure that that fix is really going to stick and that it's going to be now newly elevated in our existing process, again, following plan, do, check, act, right, in order to do that. And then we check and say, did that work? Okay, no, it didn't. We need to do something else, assuming that that's still the most significant block that we have, the most significant constraint, the weakest link in the chain. So that's what you're focusing on, is how do we, can we measure the fact that that is no longer the weakest link in the chain? I had one process that I had, it's sort of a joke, but literally somebody in Nebraska that's supporting something out there with an undocumented process. You'll hear that over and over again in the IT world, right? So what is it from a data processing perspective that is keeping the organization from better applying data in support of strategy? And the easiest way to figure what that is go around and talk to the executives and say, what's your bonus going to be based on next year? And if they can't tell you what their bonus is going to be based on, then they don't have a pretty good idea what strategy is in that. So again, a little bit of walking around helps, but really focusing in there on how many of these cycles. If you've gone through 10 of these cycles and you haven't fixed something, you're definitely taking the wrong approach.
Definitely an important question to ask the execs. So, Peter, it seems in the desire to get value from data, companies skip doing the data strategy and hire a CDO to drive analytics, AI, machine learning, and sexy dashboards and call this a data strategy. Am I honest? This increases data debt, infrastructure complexity, and more rotten data. What are your thoughts? How can we fix this problem if the leadership is data illiterate?
Good question. And again, how are they going to hire somebody who they understand has the right knowledge and skills in order to be able to help them out of their own piece? So let's start off, first of all, with the name. If your data leader is called a chief analytics officer, what are they going to be focused on? Analytics. If they're focused on chief AI officer, right, they're going to be focused on AI. So that's why making something named and saying this person is in charge of data. Again, I don't like the term CDO in particular, but it's the term that people came up with who have more marketing mojo than I do in order to do this. I like the term data leader because every organization has one. And let's make sure that there is one person that's in charge of that. Shannon, have I ever told you what my license plate is?
You have. I do know
I
it.
have.
I think about it whenever somebody says garbage in, garbage out.
There you go. So again, it's just one of those things. Thank you for playing along there. Yeah, I was actually in China last week, and we had the entire audience doing this. Even though I'm pretty sure most of them didn't speak English, but they certainly understood the concept of garbage in, garbage out. So the starting point on this is to label things correctly, to make sure that we are in fact looking at data. AI is a great example of this. If you're going to use AI at all in your organization, it's only going to be as good as your data that goes into it. And so what you're sort of skipping there is the business of having to make your knowledge workers smarter about the process. Sometimes that can work in limited ways, but for the most part, you really do need to have the ability to say, look, this is the data that we're going to use as input to AI. So we need to make sure it is of at least known quality before we input it, because of course, if it's of unknown quality, how are you going to know when the results come out, whether they are real or whether they are hallucinations or whether they are valid conclusions drawn from bad inputs that go into it? It's an interesting situation that we find ourselves in. And I guess I can go ahead and say at this point too, one of the things we're starting in DAMA is leadership group around data. And so we'll be doing some work in that. You should see an announcement on the website in the next couple of months, but if you're interested, reach out directly and we can get you started in some of those areas.
Nice. I do. And it's true. Whenever someone says garbage in, garbage out, I think Peter has that license plate and I want to tell them. I want to share every time. So, Peter, what's the difference between data and AI strategy?
Good question. Difference between data and AI strategy. So let's go back and take a look. Oops, I'm at the bottom half. There we go. And see how this all fits together. There we go. I'll pop it back up so it's real obvious there. So if I don't have somebody that is managing my data governance efforts, and if one of the major results of those data governance efforts is going to be developing valuable input that we can read into an artificial intelligence and then help us do customer service better, demand planning better, logistics better, building room maintenance better, right? Whatever the goal is to do that, I'm not going to have anybody paying attention to that. I'm going to have somebody paying attention to the AI components of it, which are the algorithms. This really gets us off into one of the major problems that we have society-wise. We've started a whole bunch of data science programs. Now remember, at the moment, we still have data increasing at a much greater rate than our ability to analyze it. So just take that for granted, in spite of the fact that we're cranking out hundreds and hundreds of data scientists from wonderful colleges and universities each year. These data scientists have their primary allegiance to the algorithm, and that's not the business. In other words, if we're looking only at algorithms, there's no concept of understanding how the business can make use of these particular activities. I would go back to the elevator bit that I did a little bit earlier here and tell a little bit more of an elevator story, again, a true story that if you don't witness these things, it's kind of hard to believe them. But I was on the elevator one day with a data scientist, and the boss comes over and gets on the elevator as well. Looks down at the badge of the young lady next to me, who's the data scientist, and says, "Oh, Mia, you work for me. I see by your badge, and you've got Peter here. Tell me, how's that project going? Is he helping on this particular piece?" And Mia looks up at the boss and says, "Yes, Peter's been helpful here. We've gone from 65 to 70%. And in the time of the elevator ride, the boss's head exploded, just like you see in the cartoons, right? I'm talking, the eyes are bulging out, there's steam coming out the ears, the red face. I mean, it's, and he's lecturing me up one side and down the other about how at this organization, we never let do anything less than 100%, and that he better see both of us in his office sometime that next week to tell us how we were getting to 100% and correct this clear oversight in our approach to the process. Now, of course, you can see what happened here was complete miscommunication. In this case, Mia was reporting a correlation that she was developing that was doing quite well, but in the process of doing the investigation in this, and again, having some little difficult conversations with the CEO at that point in time, we discovered that at 65%, which she had reached 3 years ago, there was an additional $5 million a year in revenue that was unlocked in order to come up with that as a result. So here we had actually left $15 million on the floor because Mia hadn't understood the context, the business context in which she was being raised. And this is the problem with all of these various types of other activities. Everybody goes out and focus on dashboards. Great. How many dashboards do you have? I've got 1,000 dashboards. Great. Does that mean you're a good dashboard producer or a bad dashboard producer? Well, the real question is, how are people using the dashboards to actually reduce? It's got to be focused on something strategically, and strategy always involves faster, better, cheaper, or less risky. So how are we using those dashboards to achieve one of those 4 strategic goals that's important to the organization? I'm actually working with an organization right now. It's a lot of fun, where they are unfortunately paying a little bit of interest because they're not able to pay their invoices in timely fashion. So one of the things we've helped them do is develop a dashboard as a result of their work on this, where they can look into their invoice processing process and figure out where things are getting stuck. And they've managed to save literally over a couple of months at this point, $2 million in interest no question that that is developing some value. But if we were just asking, did we develop the dashboard? Yeah, we put it out there. Was anybody using it? Well, that's another question entirely. So keep focused on what those prime objectives are. How are we using the data to achieve business value? If we don't have that, we're just measuring the number of dashboards we have or the number of elements on the dashboard. You'll end up with paying for activity, not value in that. Again, great question. Thanks for asking that.
So, Peter, identifying data rot is hard when you have such a high volume. Any advice on how to tackle that?
Yes, and actually, I'll defer to my good friend Tom Redmond, who has done some really great work in that area. But let's go back and make sure everybody's following along with the question. So if 80% of your data falls into the category of data that's redundant, obsolete, or trivial, which again, I'm 40 years in this business, and the only argument I've ever gotten from anybody is that our data isn't 80%, our data is 85% rot. But nobody's gone less than that. So how do you go about figuring it out? Well, first question is, where is your important data stored, right? So in other words, do you have some data that's worth more than other data? That would typically be a master data management situation. Again, we have a webinar coming up on that in just a couple of months, if you're not familiar with that topic. But the master data items clearly have to be articulated. They're the bones of the garden. They're the principles upon which you're going to build much of your data architecture that's out there. One of Tom's ideas, and I think it's a great one, I've practiced it my entire career, is to sit down on a couple of Friday afternoons with some subject matter experts and ask questions like, oh, let's just see, let's look at our top 10 customer data. First of all, how many places is it stored? The average organization stores their customer data in 13 different places around the organization. So if you're just got it in 12, you're above average on that. And then when you do get a hold of it, let's look and see how it's referred to. Now, once again, I'll give you the easy example, which is IBM. Is it stored as IBM? Is it stored as International Business Machines? Is it stored as IBM Inc., IBM Canada? If so, how are we going to make sure that we understand how much business we do with IBM, whether they are a customer or a supplier, in order to do this, if I don't have them labeled correctly? So there are a couple of little exercises on a Friday afternoon that you can do completely without any type of technology whatsoever that will give you a good indication as to the state of your data. In fact, one of the things I think that organizations do most inappropriately is to start up a new initiative and then just move data into it. Again, data in the cloud, data in a warehouse, data products, right? Well, what's the definition of this data product? That product should come with data of known characteristics. The data doesn't have to be perfect, but if your organization can say all of our data is of an unknown quality, that's a pretty bad thing that you don't want to get out anywhere. So start to look at this. It'll give you some indicators. And if your top 10 customers are having this much trouble, that you'll probably find on that Friday afternoon session, in order to do that, you can bet that the rest of it's not going to be in better shape, for sure. Abby's book here that I referenced is How to Make Sense of Any Mess. And it's IT architecture for, I'm sorry, data architecture for non-data people. Really wonderful book in there. Great question. Thanks.
So, Peter, we've got about 7 minutes left, lots of time here. So what are the key data drivers that you recommend to focus the data strategy? We've kind of talked about that a little bit, but anything else that you want to add?
Yeah, I would say that, over the years, I find that there are really sort of 4 primary drivers: faster, better, cheaper, and less risky. And that all data strategies accrue up to some combination of those things. And that the more you try to do more of them at once, like getting faster and cheaper at the same time, the more difficult it is. I used to have a card, it's in one of my decks somewhere, but a good friend of mine would do a deal with somebody, and then he'd turn his card over, and on the back of the card, it said faster, better, cheaper. And his answer was pick 2 at most. that you can have. And that would be the next conversation that they'd have is like, okay, we're going to do this, but do you want it done faster? Do you done well? Or do you want it done cheaply? And again, very difficult to achieve all three simultaneously, almost impossible. In fact, when you add the risk component into it, it's absolutely impossible. So whatever drivers you have, they're going to be driven up. I mean, again, Walmart, cheaper, right? No question about it. I don't mean that in a bad sense that Walmart stuff is cheap, because of course, if you've ever been to Temu's got tons of cheap stuff out there. And don't worry, we love them both, right? But the real key is when we say cost is the driver, then that's going to be the primary piece that we're going to be focusing on. These are the kinds of things that you need to have. And I've never found anything else that gets into there. Faster, better, cheaper, less risky. Those are what you're going to accrue to.
Perfect. There's been a few questions in the chat. What was the group that will be starting up called again?
The data leaders group. So we're going to have in DAMA, we're going to have affinity groups, and these will be people we're going to have a new membership system sort of halfway through the year. We get that up and running. You'll be able as a DAMA member to get on this membership system and connect with other people who want to talk about data leadership, data quality, AI, whatever topics you guys come up with in order to do this. And this will help us gauge interest in the community and also help us focus in the types of activities and membership benefits that we put in place as well. So didn't mean to make it a DAMA commercial there, but yes, data leadership is definitely the first one out of the hopper.
Oh, I love that so much. That's very, very cool. So let us know how we can get involved with that.
Absolutely,
Well,
Shannon.
yeah. All right. Well, those are the questions that we have, Peter. This has been such a
Super.
great webinar.
Yeah.
What a great start of the series to the new year.
I want to thank everybody for listening and thank Shannon and Dataversity for hosting us, of course, as always. And we'll see everybody next month when our topic's going to be data model fundamentals, right? I get that right?
Yeah.
Good
Always
deal.
a hot one. All right, y'all. Well, thank you so much. And just a reminder, I will send a follow-up email by end of day Thursday to everybody with links to the slides and links to the recording. Hope you all have a great day. Thanks for being involved in everything we do and enjoy.
Cheers, everybody.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks, Shannon.